Hi, everyone. I'm sorry that I'm so late this week. I actually had this Bible study done a while ago, but I just forgot to upload it and make the video. So thanks for those that reminded me. So again, sorry about that. This week we have saved the last plague to be treated separately with the institution of Passover and some of the other festivals because they go hand in hand. So you can't really separate them. So we'll get started here in Exodus 11. And this Exodus 11 has Moses with Pharaoh once more. We have to remember that God had said this would take place back in Exodus 4. The 10th plague is actually not a surprise. It's something that we could have expected. We also have to remember that back in the beginning, Pharaoh was killing the Israelites, the Israelite males that were born. Um, and so what we can kind of see is that Pharaoh kind of built this up based on what he was doing, and we can see God bringing on Pharaoh what he himself has done. So we talked on Sunday night about tensions and the tension of God hardening Pharaoh's heart and Pharaoh kind of digging his own grave, I guess you could say. And he these passages kind of allude to like, well, he is not innocent by any means here. Um, so there you go. There's that part. We'll return to this idea of the firstborn in a bit. Anyway, that's chapter 11 in a nutshell. I don't want to focus on that for too long. So chapter 12, you have the institution of Passover, and so you have the basic instructions here. And by the way, these chapters feel like they're kind of all over the place sometimes because you have a piece of something here and a piece of something there. So you just have to kind of work these things together in your mind as they go and understand that Moses, the author, had an intention in the way he put it together. So in your study, go through, what are the basic institutions of Passover? Those are you can pick up basically from reading. And we when we think of Passover, what can come to our mind immediately is that Jesus is our Passover lamb, right? In fact, there's a big debate over when the Last Supper was and what night was it, and there's all these like timetable issues. But one thing I think is really cool is that there's good reason to believe that the moment that Jesus died on the cross, based on kind of some of the timestamps around that narrative, what was the moment where the Passover lamb would have been sacrificed in Jerusalem, um, which I think is just incredible. And in John 1, he's referred to as a Passover lamb. That Jesus is our Passover lamb finds its meaning in this Exodus passage. Death passes over us because of the blood of the Lamb, right? It's as simple as that. Um, and we, I'm saying, in what way you see hints of Jesus, that's a little, I guess it's a little tongue in cheek because this passage sheds lights on what that means. We can see glimpses of Jesus here too, where like he's the unblemished lamb. His bones weren't broken. I forget what else. I did this like a week ago, but there's a lot of things that allude to Jesus in this passage, which is really cool. Another thing that's really, really awesome about this passage is that God kind of starts their year over in this Passover, which is really interesting. It's in the first verse there. He says, okay, you've got a new calendar, which doesn't happen very often, but I think that he does this. It seems that this is kind of Jesus or God is kind of like, this is a new start for you, and I'm going to give you a new calendar to remind you of that. So the first of every year, the new beginning was supposed to remind them that their beginning, their life, came out of this major event where they were delivered from Egypt. So we can bring that onto ourselves as well, where we talk about like the new start that we've had in Christ. Where do you feel like you've had a new start or new starts? And the flip side of that is, in what way do you feel like you need a new start? The idea of placing yourself under God's protection can help us because that's what the Israelites did here. That's what the Passover is. They're saying, okay, I'm going to paint the blood of this lamb on my door, and God, it's up. I'm trusting in what you say here. What would it look like for us to trust in what God has to say? And what would that mean for the places where we feel like we're stuck and where we need a new start? Okay, moving right along here. Moving on to, let's see, we're doing, okay, yeah, this next section of chapter 12. So in this section here, we have the administration of two rituals. That's Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is like a week long. So talk about the basics of those rituals there. But more than that, notice that these rituals were supposed to be performed each year, although we find that they weren't. And the question we should ask is, what purpose does that serve? Now, I have a note here. Basically, the idea is that these rituals, if you look carefully, not everything that's said here could be practiced while they were running out of Egypt, right? Like some of it could, like the bread couldn't rise, that happened. But a lot of it is future focused. And what this is saying is like, God is saying, I want you to physically kind of reenact the event of the Exodus every year. And it was supposed to be the sense where the people were like participating in the Exodus, right? Not like actually, not to say like we were actually there, of course not. But in the best way they could, they were supposed to participate and remember. And as they did these actions with their bodies and their calendars were wrapped around it, it became a part of their community identity. It was reminding them who they were, and it connected them to the people who actually were going through the event here. And I love that quote there from the Mishnah. In every generation, a man must so regard himself as if he came forth out of Egypt. I think that's an awesome quote, and it really does apply to us. So that's why, right? That's why practicing these rituals will be important to the faith of the Israelites. When we don't practice things, when we don't go to church, when we don't spend time in community, when we don't read our Bibles, when we don't pray, whatever the more things we regard as ritualistic, Lord's Supper, we'll talk about that in a minute, we start to lose sight of who we are. These things are meant to be reminders. It's kind of like why we pray before meals. That's kind of like a ritual, right? And we can view it as very ritualistic, but it's supposed to remind us of who we are, who God is. He's our provider. We are not. That's why we do those things. It's a daily, multiple times a day, reminding us of what is true. Now, let's think about the Lord's Supper. The Passover, or the Lord's Supper has kind of replaced the Passover. In that, we have a new Passover lamb, and the Lord's Supper is meant to remind us of that. So jumping down, to the second minor bullet point there, the question I think is, what does the Lord's Supper mean for you? Because if you think about what the Passover was supposed to be for these people, the Israelites, does the Lord's Supper have the similar impact on us? I think a lot of us would say no. Maybe it does, but I think a lot of times you just kind of go through the motions. It's something we do. And I hope this sparks a conversation for you about what it could look like to really participate in the Lord's Supper, at least to maybe change your mindset about what this is supposed to be. That the Bible talks about how we participate in the death of Christ and that we participate in his resurrection. Baptism and the Lord's Supper are supposed to remind us of that. That in some spiritual and real way, we are connected with the Lord as we follow him, we die to ourselves, we live to him. That's what it's supposed to mean. Okay, now the back half of Exodus 12 recounts the actual events of the Exodus. And I think it's amazing that they walk out plundering the Egyptians. God is not content with just running for their lives. They walk out in triumph, just showing at the end of this God versus Pharaoh battle that God not only wins, comes out on top. He comes out on top unquestionably. Now, back in Genesis 15, it talks about how this would happen. Once again, I think it's amazing, these things in the Bible. This is not a surprise. In Genesis 15, 12 to 14? Yeah, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and they will be servants there. They will be afflicted. I will bring judgment, and they will come out with great possessions, paraphrasing them. That just shows us about who God is and how he is providing for his people, and how he planned to provide for his people and bring them out, not just with rags, but just like with riches. He prospered them to show who he was. Okay, so the last section is into chapter 13. And this is where we get into more details about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. which is a bit of a repeat. But then the consecration of the firstborn is really, really interesting. So, okay, so we have some notes here in the back half of chapter 12. I feel like I've said that a lot. Really, the back half this time. The last portion of section 12 about what it looks like for a non-Israelite to participate in Passover. To be an Israelite, meant that you were part of the people, but you had to be circumcised to be a part of the covenant people. And later we see that it's a circumcision of the heart that matters. That's supposed to be that enters us into his covenant people. But it's significant that he makes a provision for foreigners to participate, because it shows us that God was never just about the Israelites. He wanted to make a way for everyone to join in this covenant. And even in verse 38 of chapter 12, we see a mixed multitude coming out. So already we see the nations participating in God's covenant. They're welcome to. So this should inform our interactions with others. And I won't get into that. But the purpose of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the consecration of the firstborn. Now, the purpose of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, both of these things are explicit. Right? So you see in verse 8 of chapter 13, 8 and 9 and 10, what the purpose of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is. It's supposed to remind them of the coming out quickly of Egypt, the instantaneous, well, not really instantaneous, but just a very quick turnover from slaves to free. And as they participated, it's supposed to remind them of that. But I think what's really interesting here is the consecration of the firstborn. I got to tell you, I was like blown away by this concept as I was studying. I did more reading for this than I've done for a lot of things. The general principle at play here is that the firstborn belongs to God. Now, don't ask me why. I don't know if I fully understand that. But God is saying that the firstborn belongs to me, kind of like the first fruits belong to me. I feel like this goes all the way back to Cain and Abel, Abel offering his first fruits and Cain not. But our first is supposed to be for God, right? Now, God redeemed the firstborn when they were coming out of Egypt, right? He figured out a way for them to avoid wrath. And by saving them, they belong to him. Now, okay, so the firstborn, this is very complicated. He saved the firstborn, right? It's the death of the firstborn as the last plague. But Israel is also referred to as his firstborn. The redemption comes by the blood of the lamb. In Numbers, so it's complicated. In Numbers, we see the firstborn belonging to God, in that they were supposed to be dedicated to his service, not in death, as pagan tribes would do sometimes. So this brings us back to this passage in Exodus. I'm sorry, that might have been confusing. Please ask me if you want to talk about it. But the basic thing we need to see here is that if you are redeemed by Christ, you are his. So this ritual of the consecration of the firstborn, I have a quote here, they are always to remember who they are, or better, whose they are. Don't ever forget, this consecration of the firstborn is a reminder, like, Israel, you are my firstborn. I saved you. You are mine. I'm calling you into a life of obedience. And the consecration of the firstborn was to remind them of that, because their identity is a function of what God has done for them. I have some verses to point you in that direction. So with that in mind, what does it mean to you that you belong to Christ? Does that idea actually impact your life, that you are his? If you claim that he saved you, really what we're learning here is that you are his, and that should mean something about how you live your life. So think about the Egyptians. They were saved from slavery to walk in the ways of God, right? They're saved from something and to something. A lot of times we just think we're saved from hell, right? Like we got our ticket out of hell. That's not the full picture of salvation. Salvation is both a negative and a positive thing. Like you're not just saved out of something, you're saved to a newness of life. And oftentimes I think we miss that "to" piece. So I'm asking, what were you saved from, and what were you saved to, or are you saved to? Or what newness of life have you found? And I hope this sparks some people's brains to think like, okay, my salvation's not just about get out of jail free. I can actually walk in a newness of life. Um, and so that leads me to the worksheet that I have on the second page. This is your challenge this week. I hope this will give something tangible for people to do. I have some examples there. What has God saved you from? What has God saved you to? So I hope people will do this and you can chat about it. Let me know if you want to talk more. Again, sorry for late notice. See ya.